speakers from different countries, from different cultures. And this is the idea of the ISCTO conference. We will start today with our very respectable keynote speakers. We will start with Dr. Pavan. He is the chairman. He is the author of 15 books, including Competency Management Professional Guide. He has 30 years career. He has worked in 52 countries. He is currently the director of Malaysian Human Resources Development Fund in Ministerial Appointments. He is also a founder of Asia Shahri Congress. Dr. Pavan will talk to us today about the competency management, which is very important and very up-to-date topic in the area of human resources development, and about the use of competency management for a competitive workforce. So, please join me to welcome Dr. Pavan.
Good morning. Okay. While we just understand that, let me just wish you a blessed primary Arabic Sabbath. I'm delighted to be here. Last session when we heard Ramcharan, of course Ramcharan gave us a lot of stories, and I think I'm reminded of the story this morning. There were a few young kids playing out football, and I think one of the important things was there was a priest who lost his way to the post office. And so just trying to figure out the way to the post office, he goes up to the young kid and he says, "Son, can you just show me the way to the post office?" And the young kid says, "Father, what you need to do is to just go straight, take a 9 o'clock and then a 3 o'clock, and then take the left, and then take another right, and another 70 degrees, and you'll get to the post office." The priest was confounded by the complexity of the instructions, so he said, "Look, son, let's have a deal. I'll give you a chocolate if you would just go with me and show me the way to the post office." "Yes, Father, I'll show you." And so they commenced the journey. As the journey went on, the father sensed an opportunity and said, "Son, do you pray?" The young kid said, "Occasionally." And the father said, "You know something, son? If you listen to me for the next few minutes about God, I'll show you the way to heaven." And the young kid said, "Thank you, Father, but I don't think so. You don't even know the way to the post office. I doubt it." So every time I've spoken in conferences around the world, everybody just wants me to show the way. But I think in the next 30 minutes, what I'm going to do is to just share with you some of the ways by which other organizations have succeeded, and just share with you some recent developments in the world of competency. There's a famous saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In Australia, where Yen is, they just slightly changed it. They say power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, and nevertheless, to make a point, I will just use some PowerPoint. The conference chair, Dr. Jamal, called me up and said, "Look, Pavan, could you send me a nice photograph of yourself for the brochures?" So I sent him one. And he came back and said, "Well, could you send me a nicer photograph?" And then I sent him another one, and he came back and said, "Do you think you have a photograph that I could put on the brochure?" And then my wife said, "I doubt it very much." Nevertheless, she gave me this photograph, and she said, look, that's the best one you ever got. And that was 5 years old. Yeah, and I never got a better picture after that. But over a period of 30 years, I have got to being somewhere there. Now, the point is, everybody talks about reaching a mature competency model very early on. But I think it's very important for us to remember, we need to take those baby steps across. We need to take some of those experiences, learn from those experiences, and allow the system to mature. We're not talking about 30 years. We're not talking about 40 years. We're at least talking about 12 months to 18 months for a system to be refined and become sophisticated and mature. And that's the key. Before I move on, let me just outline what I'm going to do in the next 27 minutes. Share with you 5 ideas, and that's what I'm going to do. Share with you 5 ideas. But you see, my name is Palan. I've got some Malaysian friends in the audience, and I've got some Indian friends in the audience. As a Malaysian Indian, it's important for me to just outline very much. That's not my full name. My full name is much longer. My full name is Palaniappan Meenakshi Sundaram Velayam Ramanathan. So most of the time I tell my students, if you get it correct, then you don't have to sit for your examinations. And in the US, if anybody catches me for overspeeding, I can be sure I never get caught for a ticket, because when the policeman sees my ID and stumbles out, Pala, Pala, he just says, don't let me catch you again, get out. So, Pala is the name, and let's look at the first of the key ideas, and that is promoting the competency model performance lift. The first thing, is there a predictive validity of competency models? Do they lead to performance? Or is it a resource-intensive effort, as most CEOs say, with little returns on investment? Is it too complicated? That's the question. Now, there have been many arguments out there which say, look, there are many other variables, and therefore linking competencies directly to performance, the correlation is difficult to prove. But we do have a challenge. We have to show that there is a competency model performance link in whatever ways we want to look at. In nations where they're looking for skilled economies, the focus is on threshold, looking at the national occupational skill standards. Organizations focusing on superior performance, they look at behavioral and professional competence. But at the end of the day, the goal is we do want to ensure that there is a competency model performance link. Otherwise, it's going to be an intellectual exercise in utility. All of the recent reports, let's take the conference board, let's take Burson and Associates, all of those agencies which work in the world of work, or get into the university libraries, digital libraries, look at the academic work, all of them emphasize that the most significant, the fourth most significant risk that CEOs face today is human capital risk. Human capital risk is the fourth most significant. Now, if that's so, then we want to look at some of the components. Let's look at some of the components. Yeah. Uncertainty out there in the global environment, change due to people, significant human capital costs, information, enterprise resource management, risk profiles due to lack of competent people working in critical positions. Very critical positions. We do not have competent people. We do not have safe to work permits, competent to work permits, and that's a serious issue which requires in some very high critical industries, insurance companies to say, look, we're not going to insure this because it's very risky for us. And of course, at the end of the day, the global competency model itself is not in place, and therefore insurance industries have a challenge. It starts off with self-awareness and self-assessment. I think honestly moving forward, we want to be just aware of what are some of the organization challenges, what are some of the industry challenges. So if you take the aviation industry today, you can look around the world. Most airline companies, with the exception of a few, are losing money because of huge challenges. Some of them grab the bull by the horn and say, these are our challenges. Some of the challenges are external, but we could focus on some of the internal challenges. Some of it is because productivity is low, because our employees are not able to perform to higher levels of productivity. So it's about getting that self-awareness and doing a self-assessment and honest audit. And I think an honest audit is very important. I have a little story. Many years ago, I went to attend a program by a very famous guy called Tony Robbins. And Tony Robbins runs this program called Awaken the Giant Within. So I thought, let me awaken the giant within me, unleash the potential. So I paid them 5,000 Singapore dollars, went out to Singapore. And Tony Robbins is an presenter for excellence. He could mesmerize you, spellbind you, just keep you on your toes continuously for hours together. And that's the kind of power that Tony Robbins has. But he does one thing. He says, I want you to overcome your fears. And therefore, I want you to walk on hot coal. And then you will figure out who you are. So I went back, I walked on the hot coal, I went back home, and I went back, my children, both my sons, they just laughed, and they asked me, Dad, did you overcome your fears? Did you awaken the giant within you? Did you unleash the potential within you? I said, children, I walked on fire. And my kids laughed and they said, you didn't have to go to Singapore and pay $5,000 to do that, Dad. I said, what do you mean? You just come to the nearby temple, we'll get the priest to get you to walk for free. So you don't have to go out to look for something, because most of the time you'll find, like what Ram said yesterday, your common sense principles. The second of those ideas, if we promote the competency model performance link, it was interesting because what I'm going to share jive with Ram's ideas yesterday. One of the ideas is that competency management, and for a moment it looked like a CEO talking to me. He said, there's 27 descriptors, nobody understands any of those descriptors, nobody looks at it, but we want them. And if one size fits all, it doesn't work any longer, why this group? So what you're saying is it's a resource-intensive effort. So really, the key is accelerating talent segmentation. Having multiple models within an organization. Now we use 4 labels. Now what probably I'll share, very similar but like business leaders with a profit and loss orientation. So what are some of those key competencies that we're going to look for in the business leaders? In Singapore Airlines, one of the key is that we want them to take risks. So there are, let's say, a very successful airline in Malaysia called AirAsia, a low-cost airline. The competencies are being business savvy for all P&L leaders. Number 2 is the functional specialist. For example, in the airline industry, you have artisans. In the electronic industry, you've got testers. And then, of course, you've got the integrators, which Ram talked about, bringing everything together and the experts. Now, what are each of these segments? One thing, what is the competency model linked for each of these segments to performance? We want to ensure that there is a focus on that. The current practice does not jive with either of those 2 ideas that I shared. If you want to promote a competency model performance link, or you want to accelerate the talent segmentation because the needs are different, then the current practice of a one-dimensional model doesn't work anymore. The one-dimensional model is we look at the job, and therefore we have skill standards. We have the National Occupational Skill Standards. We say it's NVQ level 1. In Malaysia we say SKM 345. It's very useful. Why? Because there's an economic compulsion. We need job creation. Every nation wants a skilled workforce, and therefore we want to keep moving up the skills route. It's very important. And that focus is about the job. Organizations wanting superior performance look at the person, whatever the characteristics we are talking about. But we do know that sometimes there are things different from just the job of the person, the superior performance of the activity. Post 9/11, I was in Australia. I went across the Melbourne customs and I was stopped. And the guy said, "Excuse me, sir, could you step out? The computer will pick you out and check." For a moment I thought I was like Shah Rukh Khan. Shah Rukh Khan, the famous Indian actor who was stopped in the New York airport for 2 hours, and they had a diplomatic spat because he was a famous actor who was stopped because my name is Khan. I just thought maybe my name is Pala, that's why I'm stopped. Anyway, I turned around to the young Australian customs officer and I said, "Look, I've got a Department of Multicultural card, I've got a permanent residence, and why would the computer pick me out for random checks? Why are you picking me out?" And young guy, he just turned up, didn't take a long time to think, and he just said, "Sir, from time to time, we pick out some very important people, VIP, for some special checks. And today it happens to be you. And if you will only just cooperate with me for 30 seconds, you and I will be done with this, and I'll escort you out to your car."
He's a police officer.
He was a skilled investigator. He was a very polite customer service agent, but he also was able to understand the context. And the context was disappointment, and he was able to bring it. Now, any one-dimensional model does not take into consideration the context. It could be the cultural context, it could be the work-based context, it could be anything, it could be a situation. It just doesn't take that. How do we get people like that young Australian, and later I figured out he hadn't even had a degree. How do we actually build that kind of performance into someone without that being elevated to a supervisor and bringing in more people and thereby increasing the human capital cost? There is a mismatch when we have one-dimensional models. I certainly can drink the soup with the fork. There is a mismatch because the person is in the wrong job. There is a mismatch because the way we define performance. Because every time there's poor performance, it's defaulted to the individual, and we know that the individual may not be the sole cause for poor performance. We know that the job might be designed inappropriately, and therefore the person is unable to perform. We know that sometimes the person may not have the tools to do the work, and therefore performance is an issue. So when we look at mismatch, for us to overcome the mismatch, we say, let's bring in congruence. We want to bring in congruence. And congruence has got 3 key elements. Congruence brings capacity, motivation, and opportunity. I need to have the capacity to perform, I need the motivation to perform, I need the opportunity to perform. And all require managerial intervention. In the book Tipping Point, Gladwell said the tipping point is a biography of an idea, an epidemic of an action. And what he said was, he said the Beatles were successful not because they were fabulously just skilled. Of course they were skilled. They were very good. There were also other people who were extremely good. But they also had the motivation to play 8 sets, 7 hours a day for 10 years before they hit the gold album. They had the opportunity to perform because that was the time when wherever in the environment that they lived in, there was this tremendous focus on music and the pubs, etc. So the key is bringing these 3, capacity, motivation, and opportunity together, making it congruent. We want to discover the importance of the new dimension. What are some of the new dimensions? A longitudinal study by Wei-Cheng, Dainty and Andrew outlines that. I think that is one of the key studies that came out when we said, okay, let's look at some of the new dimensions. And what are some of the new dimensions? The one-dimensional model versus the multi-dimensional model. Number one, let's take roles, not jobs. When we go to Motorola today, they don't talk about jobs, they talk about roles. You look at advertisement out with Google, they don't talk about jobs, they talk about roles. How do we segment the talent? We just talked about it, accelerating the talent segmentation. The key is to look at the difference. Number two, looking at the context. Number three, looking at the psychological contrast. And number four, passion. Let me just share with you just 4 quick analogies about each of them. First is the role of the talent segmentation. How do we get an individual to perform to a superior level? But we need to design that, not just allowing chance to happen. If we go to Singapore is a tourist city, limited by very small land mass. And the goal is that they do want to actually bring in tourists at every time. So as soon as you walk out into the Singapore airport, you will find that every moment of experience is something that's inspirational. You get into the taxi, and most countries, the taxi is the most important experience people have. And so you get into a taxi, and I had this situation. I got into a taxi and I said, look, I have to make this appointment in about 14 minutes. Do you think you could just rush me to that place? He smiled and he said, you know something, sir, I have to take you there safely. And in Singapore we have very strong limits on speeding, but I will make sure you get to the place right on time. Don't worry about it. And then he turned around to me and he said, sir, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm a trainer. And he said, that's interesting. I just attended a training program as well. Now, sometimes when you travel for 20 hours, you really don't want to talk to the taxi driver. But the guy was in a mood to talk, and he said, sir, that's interesting, sir. What do you train on? And I said, customer service. And then he said, oh, my program that I attended was also customer service. And I attend this program every year in the same training. That helped me, and I said, oh, okay, if you attend the same program every year, so does the subject change? He said, no. The jokes change a little bit. The guy has changed over the years, put on a little bit of weight. However, the content of it is still the same. And I said, aren't you bored? And he turned around to me and he said, sir, you know one thing? This is my life. How can I be bored with my life? This is my passion. How can I be bored with my passion? Now that comes out where the person is not just trained in skills or customer service, but also to go beyond and deal with different roles. He's a tourist brand ambassador. He is a customer service agent. He is a driver. And he is also the information giver. You ask him anything about Singapore, he knows. And that's the way it works. Number two, the context. I was traveling from Mumbai to Chennai to Kuala Lumpur to get back home, and unfortunately I couldn't get on to any other airline except the government airline. And I got into the government airline, which took off anyway 4 hours late. And if you can imagine my nervousness and anxiousness, that we were really, really late. We got in there, and I just tried to push back the seat, and it just fell on the guy behind me. So I just had to hold it back, and I just turned on the flip down phrase, and I couldn't put them back. So it was a kind of a difficult situation. And the flight attendant came across, and she said, sir, would you like to have something for dinner? And I said, no, thank you. And then she came back a few minutes later and said, are you sure you don't want anything? I said, no, I don't want anything as long as you can get me to connect my flight. She came back a little bit later and said, sir, are you sure you don't even want a cup of coffee? I said, the best way? What's the best way to get rid of someone who continues to talk to you? Say, yes, let me have a cup of coffee. So sometimes she gives me a cup of coffee, I just have to sit by, leave it there, and then she's gone, and she comes back after 10 minutes and says, so you didn't like the coffee? I said, no, it's alright. So she said, "Sir, if you don't like the coffee, I can always make you another cup of coffee." And that day, most of my perceptions about that governor airline were erased, at least to some extent. Because one attentive flight attendant, paying attention to the context, could change my views. And that is the psychological context. You take the Gen Y today, and they are not bothered about the legal employment contract. It's all about psychological contracts. And how do we actually bring in the components? What is some of those psychological contract components? When you break a psychological contract, research clearly shows that it's very difficult to engage your employees. Even the perceptions of a broken psychological contract is far more dangerous. Therefore, we need to pay attention. Passion. What is passion? And how do we actually build this passion into our employees? Get them to move from thank God it's Friday to thank God it's Monday. There are real world examples which I'll share with you later. You can take Google, you can take Singapore Airlines, you can take Dabawala in Bombay, and there are several examples which we can share. I just want you to just look at this quick 20-second video. I think we'll just share that later on. It's a video from Volkswagen which just talks about how they build fun into the workplace. The third idea that I just want to share with is bringing in the learning orientation to acquire some of these new dimensions. And we know that it's learning informally and socially that's far more powerful. The fourth idea is bringing in the component of accountability into the competency. Bringing in the new dimensions and building accountability. Asking people the question before the question, what can I do, rather than who was responsible for that. Getting people to walk the talk. And of course moving away from feedback to feed forward. We know what Goldsmith said. What did Goldsmith say? Feedback is not real time, you want to go feed forward. And Ram talked about that yesterday as well. What got you here only achieved. And that's the simple message. So the one-dimensional model serves us for some extent, but when we want to move further into a world fueled by uncertainty and change, we need to bring in the new dimension. Last but not the least, the fifth idea is never give up on value creation. Never give up on value creation. And let's not think that complexity is everything. Simplicity is when we understand complexity to its fullest. And that's, I think, key. And therefore, let's not give up. How do we move forward? People don't like the word benchmarking today. People don't like best practices today because they want to set the path. But I'll just finish up with just this little analogy. We need to do benchmarking and we need to move forward, but according to statistics, the professor always said that you compare apples with apples, oranges with oranges. My son came back home one evening and he showed me the report card, and I looked at the report card and I said, "Son, this doesn't justify your father's reputation." He said, "Dad, it's not fair to compare me with you because you went to school 40 years ago, and what we study in school today is far more than what you studied 40 years ago." So I said, "Why can't I compare you with your friend who has done much better than you?" And he said, "Dad, that's not a good benchmark." And I said, "Why not?" That is kind of sensitive, but if you want to let me know, my friend's father is far more intelligent than you. So when we start doing benchmarking and best practices, I think we just want to look at what's appropriate. The next time you hear the word competency, it's just simple. Remember, one dimension doesn't work. We want to bring in multi-dimensional roles, talent segments, context, psychological contract, passion. But you can very well remember Why? Because Parliament is nothing else other than promoting the performance competency model links, accelerating the talent segmentation, learning to incorporate the new conventions, accountability, and never ever giving up on value creation. That's what it's all about. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this useful information about very important issue. Now we will start with Dr. Ian Williamson. Dr. Ian Williamson is the chair of leadership for social impact of the Melbourne Business School in Australia. Dr. Ian will present a paper about the human resources and its role in writing term English.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Very good. Thank you very much for having me here. It's really been an honor. This is my first time to Kuwait, and it's definitely grateful that my first time is at such a wonderful event. I'm here to talk about HR's role in driving innovation. And so at some point in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about what role I think that HR can play in actually making that happen. But I want to start off with this first point of why do we care about innovation? Why is it something I even think that HR should be doing anything with? Now, I'm sure when you say innovation in most of your organizations, that there's an innovation plan of some sort. Would you agree that someone in your organization is saying we need to be more innovative? Usually it's not the case that organization leaders are against innovation. But I actually want to sort of emphasize this a little more clearly because I think in the time and place that we are right now, innovation is probably one of the most critical components of organizational survival. That's not even talking about success. I think it's one of the most critical components of organizational survival. And if you think about what's happened over the last 4 years, we have seen unprecedented change in terms of political change, social change, and clearly economic change. We've gone through this global financial crisis, the greatest financial crisis of our lifetime. And, I think this is where we can look back at history and ask some interesting questions. Because while this was a once-in-a-lifetime type of occurrence, it was not the first recession that we experienced. And while your organizations have survived, congratulations, you made it through this catastrophe and you survived. I think there's some interesting information about what happens after a recession that we need to think about. So to share with you some research that was done by a group of Harvard and Northwestern professors. They asked a very interesting question. They said, what happens to organizations after recessions? And we know what happens to organizations during recessions, right? They go down, they lose sales, and if they go down enough, they go out of business. Now, normally we think that once we've made it through a recession, we can kind of pat ourselves on the back. We did a good job, we got through the hard part, let's take a break. But what this research suggests is that perhaps there's an American phrase, out of the frying pan into the fire. Anyone ever heard that before? Where you jump out of one bad situation, you wipe in the air, you think, phew, got out of that situation. But when you land, you realize you're in the worst spot than where you were before. And I think that's actually where we are right now. So this research asked this question. It said, let's look at the last 3 recessions that America or North America has experienced. 1980, 82, 1991, 2000, 2002. Interesting how they all come every 10 years, just like the last one did, just like the next one will. And they said, what happens to these 2,400 public companies after these recessions? They all made it through the recession, they all survived. What happened afterwards? So 3 years later, the numbers are actually very interesting. 17% of the firms that made it through the recession 3 years later, they didn't fail. These organizations are so permanently scarred, so permanently damaged by the recession that they go out of business. 17%. They thought they made it through the hard part. Little did they realize the end was yet to come. Even more troubling, 40% of the organizations that survived 3 years later never regained pre-recession sales or profits. They never get back to where they were. They're permanently crippled. They continue on, but they never get back to where they were. And perhaps the most interesting statistic out of this study, 9% of these 2,400 organizations actually exceeded pre-recession profits or pre-recession sales. 9%. Now, when I read this study, I thought about it, and I checked the statistics to sort of make sure this was accurate. I said, this is something that we need to think about. Why is this happening? What is going on? Why did these organizations make it through this recession, yet on the back end, most of them, the vast majority of them, are not able to thrive like they once were? The reality is, recessions are external shocks. They're similar to dramatic political changes. They're similar to technological changes. They're similar to social changes. They're shocks. They permanently change the rules of the game. And in doing so, they pick the winners and they pick new losers. And what's interesting is 9% of organizations that exceeded their previous performance after recession, not all of those organizations were doing well before the recession. Even more interesting, the 17% that failed, many of those organizations were doing quite well before the recession. The recession picks the winners, it picks new losers. I can think of no better example to really illustrate this point than to think about the Sony versus Apple situation. Now, yesterday we had a speaker that asked individuals how many of you had an iPhone or iPod. And I noticed that about 50% of the people in the room raised their hand. And if I was an Apple executive, I'd have a big smile on my face. Right? Because that's the number I want, and that's the number that allowed us to become, or them to become, the most profitable, most valuable company in the world. But let's go back in history. Because Apple launched the iPod in October of 2001. And at that time, there were no people standing in line to get this product. It wasn't seen, it wasn't a world-around event. Most people didn't even give it much credibility. This was an organization, Apple, that was failing. That was, at that time, an example in business schools of what not to do. Sony, on the other hand, by and far, had the dominant share of the portable music device industry. Anybody remember the Walkman? Yes, we all have one somewhere in our closet somewhere, right? Everyone had it. And, no one had an Apple, no one cared. Sony actually had the technology for a digital MP3 player. Interestingly, Sony also owned a record company. So not only do they have the devices that could play music, they own the music. How is it that Sony could not come up with what Apple came up with? Now, this is in the middle of a recession. Sony said, we're going to hold on to our cash. We're not going to invest in this product right now. We'll wait till the recession's over. Then the demand will come back, and we will forge ahead. Apple, on the other hand, is desperate. They have no choice. They need a breakthrough, otherwise they're going to go out of business. They forge ahead, do all their R&D and investment on this product during the recession, launch their product, and of course nobody has anything that's comparable. At that time, Sony had somewhere over 70% of market share for the mobile portable music device. Today, Apple has 75% of the market share. Anyone want to guess what Sony's market share is for the MP3 player? Less than 3%. It's 10 years. See, when the change comes, it comes fast. There's no hesitation. Recessions change the rules of the game. They pick the winners and they pick the losers. And whether or not you were a winner in the past has nothing to do with what's going to happen for you in the future. That's a very humbling thought. And innovation is the key to dealing with these shocks. Those organizations that can innovate, those are the organizations that are able to deal with the new rules and thrive. And those organizations that cannot, those are the organizations that fail. I don't know if anyone noticed, I was reading the local newspaper yesterday, and they actually had an article on Sony. And talking about how Sony has gone away for the last 2 years, they've changed CEOs, and how they are now going into what they believe is their last-ditch effort to catch up. And they've been trying to catch up for 10 years. The rules of the game have changed. Now, you can survey executives around the world in terms of what happens after the global financial crisis. 26% of executives surveyed identified innovation as the number one priority for their organization. And even those that did not identify it as number one, 45% saw it as being one of the top 3 things that their organizations have to focus on. Innovation is the way you deal with these external shocks. Now, what is innovation? So I've sort of talked to you about why it's important. What is it? Well, we oftentimes think of innovation as this aha moment, right? We think of Einstein. We think of this moment where you come up with an idea that nobody else has thought of. Well, that's true. Innovation is creation. But the reality is, you know what? It's a big world and there are a lot of smart people. There's a lot of ideas that have already been thought about. It's very rare you come up with an idea that no one else has thought about. And even when you do, you have to figure out a way to harness that idea to convert it into something that is tangible. A new product, a new service, something that you can use to make money or provide value to your constituents. And what we know from the research is that this is actually sometimes more difficult than coming up with a new idea. My point here, innovation is more than just a bunch of good ideas. Without the ability to harness those ideas into something that is tangible, you actually have no value created for the organization. And we know this is difficult. The research suggests that 50% of new ideas generated in organizations or R&D efforts actually never materialize into any type of value for the organization. And when you survey executives and you ask them, what are the biggest hurdles to us being more innovative? Their answers, number 1, risk-averse culture. I can come up with ideas, but I can't get my people to take the chance to try something new. We know we have good ideas, but my people are too afraid of making a mistake to try something new, so we keep doing what we've been doing. Number 2, the time it takes for us to try it. We take too long to harness. We've identified opportunities, but we take too long to harness and others become the fun. We're like Sony. We knew there was going to be digital music. It just took us too long to figure out how to make a digital music player. You know, interestingly, number 5 is not a good idea. This is only the 5th concern they have. The issues around harnessing are far more difficult than the creation aspects. So, how can firms overcome these barriers to innovation, and what role does HR play in this, if any, to make this happen? That's what I want to spend the rest of my time with. Now, I've spent the last 10 years of my life working with a wide variety of organizations in over 15 countries across 6 continents, talking to executives and leaders about how do you actually derive value from your workforce. Whether we're talking about construction organizations, aviation organizations, military organizations, government organizations. And I think there's been some important insights that I've been able to come from based on this research and those consulting opportunities. And I want to share with you 3 ideas that I've had thus far. Acquiring complementary resources, combination, and opportunity recognition. What I consistently see in my research is that those organizations that can do these 3 things well tend to be able to be more innovative or out-innovate their competitors. And I want to just walk you through each of those and give you a little bit of insight into them, and then maybe this afternoon or after the morning session, we can dive a little deeper. So acquiring complementary resources. What is this? This is not a new idea. There was a very well-known, world-renowned economist, a woman named Penrose, who came up with this idea in the 50s. And it's a simple statement. Exactly the same resources when used in combination with other types of resources can provide different services or sets of services. And all she's simply pointing out here is that most innovation is not coming up with new ideas. It's taking existing information, 2 pieces of existing information, and bringing it together in a way that had not been done before. They're complementary forms of knowledge. And it is this complementarity which actually drives innovation. And the point here is innovation is driven by the acquisition of complementary resources, bringing together 2 things that previously people had not seen as fitting together, but actually fit together. I'll give you an example. So we did some research in colleges in the United States looking at what is the factor that drives the patent output of organizations. Patents, obviously, are a huge indicator of the innovation of an organization. And if you were in a high technology organization, this is a big predictor of your performance. The more patents you have, typically the more money you can make. So we know that if you spend a lot of money on R&D, you get patents. We're pretty well established. Go hire some engineers, put them in a lab, lock them in there, tell them they can't come out until they come up with a good idea. You'll get some good ideas. But the actual conversion of that idea, the harnessing of that idea from being an idea to a product, requires some additional effort. You have to have somebody that understands how to patent. You have to have someone who understands patent law. You have to figure out how to defend that idea from an intellectual property perspective. And you know, the reality is, most engineers don't know how to do that. It's not what they were trained to do. They come up with a whole bunch of ideas, but if you ask them which is the one we should commercialize, most of them go, I don't know, it's not my problem. But look how cool it is. They don't really think about it that way. So we identify, having some patent law expertise in your organization helps you tremendously in terms of your ability to harness. And so the idea is, if I have complementary ability, R&D capability, and patent law expertise, this allows me to go create ideas and harness ideas, and I should be able to generate higher levels of output. What do we find? Well, we looked at a group of Fortune 500 firms and we tracked them over 10 years, trying to identify what were the firms that were most productive in generating patents. And what did we see? Well, you know what? Our theory was right. Those organizations that had high R&D, but also had a high level of patent law expertise, they hired patent lawyers and put them in key parts of their organization, they generated the greatest patent output. But even more insightful